Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Connors, and I am in the Houston office of Mayor Brown. I am a finance attorney, a general finance attorney, but I have a specialty in energy finance. I represent financial institutions and borrowers in debt facilities. And I'm really excited to be here talking to everybody today. I would say good morning, but I know so many of you are calling in from around the world, and it's almost the end of your day. So thanks for joining us. But in any event, today we are talking about the US and EU focus on critical minerals, and I will be covering the Inflation Reduction Act for the first part of the presentation, and then my colleague Nikolai Muslin will be covering the EU side, and Nikolai is a partner out of our Brussels office, and he is also the co-leader of the International Trade Product Group. Okay, so let's get started. Just to give you a little bit of background on my interest in the IRA. When the IRA first came out about a year and a half ago, I thought, well, this could really be beneficial to my clients, being an energy finance lawyer and doing a lot of mining work and oil and gas work. And so I started reading and doing a lot of articles and doing a lot of speaking engagements. And now here we are, a little over a year and a half later. I will say that there is a lot under the IRA. I would love to have more time to speak on more topics under the IRA, but I'm going to mainly be speaking on kind of hot topics and topics that are relevant to my practice area. But by all means, you are welcome to reach out to myself or Nikolai with any questions after our webinar, and we'll be happy to chat with you. Okay, so the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law by President Biden in August of 2022. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. Okay, the IRA was signed into law by President Biden in August 2022. It was very controversial as it was only approved by Democrat Congress members. It included the general tax credit framework from the Build Back Better Act that was passed in 2021 and also built on Biden's bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. However, the IRA pivoted and kind of amplified the focus on clean energy and reaching our net zero climate goal by 2050 and 2030. The IRA originally included $369 billion in extensive green tax incentives, and it's a little funny to say that number now because the number has increased so much, but it really was the largest and most aggressive U.S. investment in climate policy to date, and it definitely is a landmark policy. We are now a little over 1 year out, and Goldman Sachs did a recent study that showed that the IRA will provide an estimated $1 trillion in tax incentives over the next 10 years and up to 9 million jobs, which is really impressive. The IRA is targeted to, among other things, accelerate private investments in clean energy solutions, strengthen critical mineral supply chains, and boost domestic manufacturing and end the reliance on China's dominance in critical mineral processing and battery manufacturing. It is also focused on increasing job creation and investments in underserved and brownfield communities. And while the main focus of the IRA is definitely clean energy and climate mitigation, there are other areas that the IRA touches on, such as agricultural assistance for farmers, consumer subsidies for green products, land conservation, and healthcare and pharmaceutical plans for seniors. The IRA is very far-reaching, and it's pretty neat because it covers so many areas that there's a lot of collaboration on the legal front. So our tax colleagues are working with the renewables folks and the employment folks and the natural resources folks. It's pretty neat. Okay, next slide, please. So let's jump right into it. This is a tax credit that is most notable to me in my practice as a mining finance lawyer. This new tax credit was aimed at renewable battery supply manufacturers, but it's also a huge benefit for mining companies and critical mineral producers and processors and refiners. 45X created tax credits for the production of certain eligible components in the US to unrelated persons. The category of eligible components include solar energy components, wind energy, inverters, qualifying battery components, and then this category of critical minerals. You'll see that I've included the list of the 50 critical minerals that were designated by the IRA. These came from the Energy Act of 2020, which were selected based on minerals that were essential to economic and national security. You'll note that I've underlined the 5 most notable critical minerals for EVs and cell phone batteries and solar panels. What you'll note is that copper is not on here, and we'll get to that in a minute. There are also some purity requirements required that are needed for tax credit eligibility, and you'll see that they're pretty high. I included the definition here for lithium, 99.9%, right? So, okay, so next slide, please. Let's talk about copper for a minute, controversial copper. Copper really does play an integral part in the energy transition. It's used for solar components, wind components, the EVs, and many other sectors. The demand for copper is being accelerated by the IRA. The demand in 2023 is projected to be 2 to 3 times higher than it was the year before, and the U.S. is import dependent for copper. In 2022, 65% of the U.S. refined copper imports were from Chile, and only 21% of Chile's exports were to the U.S. However, up to 40% of Chile's exports go to China, so they have a good trade relationship with China. In March 2023, the USGS controversially denied adding copper to the list of critical minerals based on the fact that the US had trade with reliable partners that could source copper, and then we did have domestic capacity of copper. But this caused a huge amount of political pushback, including from some of the heavy hitters like Rio Tinto and BHP and Freeport-McMoRan, and they pushed for their representatives to get copper covered. And fast forward 3 months later, in August 2023, the Department of Energy announced its critical materials assessment for 2023, and copper was included as a critical material. And I'll note, not a mineral, but a material, because it was designated near critical in this medium term from 2025 to 2035, which is when we're really focusing on meeting our net zero goals. And the DOE announced that this list would inform eligibility for government subsidies under the IRA. So this was really historic because this was the first time that copper had been included as critical, and it followed in the footsteps of, or the US followed in the footsteps of the EU, Canada, Japan, and China. There is confusion about what this inform eligibility means. The critical minerals list has not yet been amended to include copper, but the IRS and Treasury and the Department of Energy have teamed up for a program under the IRA, which I'll talk about later. It's tax credits under 48C, and they did allow copper projects for the project applications. And in fact, the period for the deadline for project applications was extended 3 days to account for this change. Next slide, please. Okay, so these tax credits are still very new. We are still not into one full taxable year yet. The eligibility began for the sale of eligible components sold after December 31, 2022. You'll see that the tax credit is dependent on the type of component and material produced. In my world, I'm focused on the mineral credit, and that's 10% of the cost incurred by the taxpayer with respect to the production or extraction of the refining. So it's really a significant amount. Next slide, please. Even more exciting is that these tax credits can be stacked. So you can add this 10% to other credits that you're eligible for. They are also eligible for a direct cash payment for up to 5 years. If a company does not have sufficient operating income, they can essentially get a check from the US government that would be paying them for their tax credits that they would be otherwise eligible for. The tax credits can also be exchanged for cash. The only caveat is that they can only be transferred once, and then the tax credits have to be transferred all together. We are also seeing that these are trading on 85 cents to 95 cents on the dollar. There is a phase out for eligible components under Section 45X, but the phase outs for solar, wind, converter, and battery components. There's no phase out for eligible components that consist of critical minerals. So essentially, these critical mineral producers can take advantage of these tax credits indefinitely at this point. Next slide, please. Another area under the IRA that is getting a lot of attention, especially among automakers, is the Section 30D credit. This is the clean vehicle tax credit. This was an existing tax credit. However, the IRA included new stringent conditions. This is a tax credit that is eligible, or this is a tax credit of up to $7,500, and it's split into a critical minerals requirement and a battery component requirement. To be treated as a qualifying critical mineral for the critical minerals requirement, the critical minerals used in the EV battery must be either extracted or processed in the US or in a country that has a free trade agreement or an FTA agreement with the US, or recycled in the US. So the first part of this test is the 50% value added test. It's 50% of the value added of mining, processing, or recycling the critical mineral has to occur in the US or an FTA partner country, and then it would be deemed a qualifying critical mineral. The second part of the test is to qualify this for the subsidy for the battery component requirement. The battery must contain a certain percentage of qualifying critical mineral content. The required share starts at 40% for 2023 and increases 10 percentage points each year until it reaches 80% at the end of 2026. I have oversimplified these computations. They're much more complicated than that, but the percentages I've given are actually kind of where you need to come out at the end of the day. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, starting in 2025, an EV battery may not contain any critical mineral that was extracted, processed, or recycled by a foreign entity of concern. By statute, we know that these foreign entity of concerns are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. There is an interesting gray area about what it means to be controlled by foreign entity of concern, and if you would still be eligible for tax credit. And the Treasury and IRS are expected to release guidance on that sometime next month. These domestic content rules have caused a lot of frustration in the industry and around the globe, especially with our trade allies such as the EU. We currently don't have a free trade agreement with EU, and Nikolai is going to talk about that a little bit more. But this next slide shows a list of all the current FTA countries. There are 20 FTA countries. If you count this list out, you actually have an additional 2 countries included, or I should say the second to last bullet point is the new NAFTA trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And then you also have Japan listed. While Japan is not traditionally an FTA country, in March of this past year, Biden entered into, or the Biden administration entered into a CMA with Japan. And in April, the Treasury released guidance saying that for purposes of the IRA, Japan would be treated as a free trade agreement country with respect to battery minerals. So to meet climate goals, we will need approximately 19 times more nickel, 21 times more cobalt, 25 times more graphite, and 42 times more lithium. And we all know that the local capacity of the US is not enough to source those amounts. So it's really important that the US collaborate with these countries and then enter into additional free trade agreements with other countries so that we can meet our goals. And I would be remiss not to mention that there are negotiations going on with other countries, but there is some tension between the Biden administration and Congress as to what countries can be eligible for a free trade agreement. Congress is saying that all free trade agreements need to be approved by Congress, and to the extent they have only been approved by the Biden administration, they are saying they're not effective. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about additional loan programs and grant programs that fall under the IRA umbrella that are either Department of Energy programs or Department of Defense programs. And this is not an all-inclusive list. These are just the programs that we're seeing in our firm and in my practice group in particular with clients, and we're working with them to help them submit their applications and deem what program would be most beneficial to them and what program that they would be eligible for. So the first of these programs is a Qualified Advanced Energy Project Credit, and that's a 48C credit. That is the program that I mentioned earlier in this webinar about copper projects being allowed. This was an existing credit. It was established in 2009. The IRA expanded the program by appropriating up to $10 billion in investments. This past current round that closed out in early August, 4 billion was allocated to this round, and there were over 42 billion in applications submitted. So we'll see where those come out over the next year, but obviously from 4 billion to 42 billion, that's an enormous jump. This program covers projects that expand clean energy manufacturing and recycling and critical mineral refining, processing, and recycling projects that reduce greenhouse gas emission. And if you qualify for this program, you actually could be allowed a tax credit of up to 30% if you meet other eligibility requirements. The next program is the Title 17 Clean Energy Financing Program. The IRA granted additional expansion of 40 billion in guarantees for loans for eligible projects. This program was originally geared towards fossil energy and nuclear energy projects and has now been expanded to critical mineral processing and manufacturing as well. Next page, please. The next program I'm going to talk about is the EIR program. This is the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. This is one of the LPO programs, if you've heard that mentioned. This is a new long-term loan program of up to 250 billion in guarantees for loans for eligible projects. And this credit is, or this program is for projects that repurpose energy infrastructure that is no longer operating, and also projects that enable infrastructure to reduce or sequester pollutants or GHG emissions. The other program that we're seeing applications for is the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Direct Loan. And under this particular loan program, the IRA removed the program's lending cap and then also allocated an additional 3 billion for automakers for a range of advanced technology and for vehicles and components. The Domestic Manufacturing Conversion Grant was allocated an additional 2 billion in grants. And this is funding to support domestic manufacturing of hybrids and plug-in hybrids and fuel cell vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is last but not least, but this is all the other programs were Department of Energy programs, and this is a Department of Defense program. This is the Defense Production Act program, which allows the president to expand supply of used materials and services for national defense purposes. And the IRA included 500 million for the enhanced use of the DPA for strengthening U.S. supply chains for critical minerals. And I've included some of the grants we're seeing for critical mineral producers. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we are 1 year out. Lithium and EV makers are obviously hot. There's a lot of movement from downstream automakers, especially in the US and the Appalachia battery belt. We've seen a lot of interest in upstream mining from automakers, and investments are happening. But at the end of the day, tax credits or not, cheaper is cheaper. And I found this description of Albemarle's Chinese factory, lithium factory, versus the current Kings Mountain, South Carolina factory. And I thought it was really interesting because the factory in China is almost half the price the South Carolina factory is 2 times as much as the Chinese factory. And so at the end of the day, critical mineral producers are going to be looking at the bottom line. Next slide, please. Okay, so while there is pressure around the world to sign up these free trade agreements so they can be eligible for the tax credits, and there's obviously focus to get battery factories started in the US, it is not clear that either of these will solve our US manufacturing issues or the domestic content issues. Mining timeframes in the US takes much longer than anywhere else really around the world. In the US, we have so much opposition by stakeholders and litigation by stakeholders to the operation of our mines, and our permitting timelines are just highly inefficient. And then on top of that, if you look at the mining timeframes versus kind of a manufacturing timeframe. Gigafactories can be built in just a couple of years. A refinery can be built in 2 years, but the mines needed to supply the mineral take anywhere between 5 to 25 years. And I will say 5 in the US is not really happening, but it can take as long as 25 years. So if we are wanting to get the critical mineral source from the US, then obviously we need to change or be more proactive about the change the permitting laws. So finally, despite the US government providing credits or capital via loans or these grants to get domestic projects up and running, if these projects don't have offtake agreements at a beneficial enough price to get the projects operating and profitable, at the end of the day, they'll be competing against Chinese producers that can use their market power to cut costs, and these projects in the US may end up failing after all. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is my last slide. So is the IRA working on what it was intending to do? And it is. In a recent study by the EPA in September, looking at kind of a pre-IRA world and a post-IRA world, it is estimated that with the changes from the IRA, economy-wide carbon dioxide emissions will be cut by up to 43%, which is below our 2005 level. So it's good news, it's working, but there's still a lot of gray areas within the IRA that need further guidance from Treasury or the IRS. And we'll just see how this plays out over the next couple months. I'm going to turn over to Nikolay now, and then we can take questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Megan. Hello, everyone. It is Brussels, European Union calling now. And let me announce where the European Union's vote on the support for critical minerals stand. I will essentially try to describe you the current draft of the Critical Raw Material Act, its key components and the key tools that it's going to use to accomplish its objectives. I think right from the start, I need to set the expectations right. Many of you know that unlike the federal government in the United States, with the IRA using as an example, European Union has no jurisdiction in the area, for example, of tax breaks, right, in the area of taxation. So one thing you will not see in the Critical Raw Material Act, you won't see any money in it at all. So my presentation will focus on the framework, on the objectives, and on the key instruments that the CRMA will implement as of next year, but it's not going to have at this stage any detailed discussion about the possible financial mechanisms, specific tax breaks, specific incentives that would promote this or another mining project. So what do we have in terms of introduction in the Critical Raw Material Act today? There are three main pillars, right? One is sufficiency. The European Union needs to develop the critical raw material value chain in order to try to catch up with the United States, which is much more advanced with the IRA and with the money already being invested. And in the long term, I think as an aspiration and as a possibility, but to try to catch up with China, in fact, as well, and significant amounts of funding will be put to that purpose as of next year, and is actually being put already as we speak. The second pillar, very important. We need to be sufficient, but we need to diversify. We cannot be dependent on a single source of supply, especially if it comes from what the CRMA calls a non-reliable partner. So diversification is another key objective of the CRMA. And the third one, which is equally and maybe even more important, if you look into the text of the CRMA, what it has more than anything are the provisions on the sustainability and circularity. The logic being very simple, with all the objectives on the consumption side that we need to catch up with, the one which Megan mentioned in terms of having to consume 20, 30 times more of lithium or of this or another raw material. There is certainly there is already a mining boom. And with all the supports that the European Union and other jurisdictions are putting forward, of course, more and more of mining will be developed around the world. So the third objective, however, is to ensure that all this mining boom doesn't come at the expense of sustainability, of the environmental issues, and of the social issues. So three pillars of the Critical Raw Material Act, and I will try to go through each of them during my presentation today. So it's sufficiency, diversification, and sustainability/circularity. Where do we stand in terms of decision making? In Europe, it's much more complex, just because the European Union, at the end of the day, is an international body. It's a sui generis institution, but it's still not as lean and straightforward as the US government. So there are a lot of players involved in the legislative process. But if we speak about the Critical Raw Material Act, in fact, its adoption proceeded through the European institutions with a remarkable speed. Given the complexity of the act, given the objectives it pursues, and possible financing implications going forward, we are standing right now almost in the end of the decision-making process. We do have an expectation that one of the key meetings today will actually be one of the last meetings putting an end to the negotiations between the two legislators we have in Europe, which is the Council and the European Parliament, such that the adoption of the Critical Raw Material Act may occur in the course of next month. It is a very remarkable process, given that the legislative proposal was tabled by the European Executive, by the European Commission, only on the 16th March of 2023. Now, the scope of the Critical Raw Material Act. There are two key concepts that the Act employs. Even though it's called Critical Raw Materials, it's actually fascinating in terms of legal drafting. So the Act is called Critical Raw Materials. Within it, you have strategic raw materials and critical raw materials, which overlap. Depending on whether you are designated as strategic raw material or critical raw material, different incentives, different obligations to a certain extent apply. But to cut a long story short, most of the focus of the CRMA is on the so-called strategic raw materials, which are characterized by their strategic importance, as follows from their name for the European economy, and especially for certain sectors of European economy, which have to do with the green transition, which have to do with the digital, which has to do with defense and aerospace application. That, in that sense, the designation is not that different from the one which IRA follows. There are also critical raw materials, which include strategic raw materials, but are also characterized by high importance for European economy, and also for the supply risk disruption potential. And which is compared to the strategic raw materials, where there is a very big gap between the existing global supply and projected demand. So the raw materials are classified into these two baskets. Different disciplines apply for the purpose of today's webinar, and generally the way you want to think about the Critical Raw Material Acts. What you will see there, what we'll discuss later on today, will apply to the 17 strategic raw materials, which are very helpfully illustrated here on that slide by our colleagues at the European Parliament. Now, what are some of the key, I would say, indicators of how the key objectives of the CRMA will be accomplished? So starting with the sufficiency of the raw materials of the supply chain. The Act is opened by an aspirational provision, which has certain targets, certain benchmark as far as the extraction is concerned, as far as the processing is concerned, and as far as the recycling is concerned. At this slide, you have those indicators as the text currently stand. I would emphasize from the very beginning that these are aspirational numbers. So they are not mandatory, and they cannot be mandatory, in fact, for legal reasons. Reasons have to do with the need for Europe to comply with its WTO commitments. So these are aspirational numbers, which, however, will certainly be very relevant and will be taken into account by the decision makers, by the financial institution when deciding on which projects to finance, which projects will qualify under so-called strategic projects designation that we will discuss in a second. Diversification of supply, the way it's explained in the Critical Raw Material Act, is again through the percentages, which are also again aspirational or rather non-binding. Again, however, the importance will be very significant when designated this or another project as strategic. The key number to remember here is that the single country dependency should not be more than 65% of the Europe's consumption. Very importantly, the objective of CRMA and financing instruments under it specifically will be to reduce the dependency on so-called non-reliable partners. That's the concept which the European legislation uses. And non-reliable partners, they're not, unlike I think in the US under the IRA, they're not mentioned by name. So we don't know who are the non-reliable partners. And legally, I think the universe of non-reliable partners can certainly change from year to year. But generally, the way union legislator approached it is to define non-reliable partners as those countries which do not share European Union values, respect for human rights, democracy, and rule of law. The parliament added a reference to China in the recitals. There is an observation that apparently dependency on China on top increases the European Union's vulnerability and security risks. So there is in the text already, at least as far as China is concerned, an indication as to which trading partners might be classified as non-reliable partners for the purpose of designation investment project as strategic. Sustainability, the third pillar of the CRMA, a very important, again, provision and very important discipline of the European Union legislation. The idea is that any projects which will be supported by the CRMA should be implemented complying with the best standards as far as the environmental protection, social protection is concerned, as well as the transparent business practices. There are certain encouragements embedded in the Act, and some of them are actually mandatory, which require compliance with certain EU rules on sustainability, international standards, guidelines, and principles. And in some cases, a third-party environmental certification scheme will be mandatory in order for a project to qualify for the supports under the CRMA. Interestingly, also, the Parliament, in the recitals, it's not part of the binding legal text, but it will inform certainly decision-making on the supports. Also mentioned that strategic projects should avoid the use of fossil fuels and should instead use the renewable energy sources. And maybe just to give you an illustration of why the sustainability requirements are in the regulation and how far-reaching the demands will be for project to qualify, here is the exact citation from the CRMA as it currently stands. That's just to emphasize once again that the sustainability requirements, sustainability strings that will be attached to the CRMA project will be very, very extensive. Now, moving to the implementation of the CRMA. So we have three objectives that the Act pursues: sufficiency, diversification, and sustainability/circularity. What are the mechanisms under the Critical Raw Material Acts to accomplish those objectives? The key instrument that the Act is using is the concept of strategic projects. The idea is that CRMA will be a vehicle, a framework going forward to attract financing to certain projects that would accomplish its objectives. And to the extent that a certain project, either in Europe or outside of Europe, satisfies those certain requirements and accomplish the objectives of the Act, it will be designated as a strategic project. It's a term of art under the CRMA. The strategic project is defined as the one which contributes to the security of supply, essentially increases the supply of the relevant raw material to the European Union. An interesting addition and nuance which have been also added as of late is that an investment into a strategic technology that is aimed at substituting some of the critical strategic raw materials, would also qualify as a strategic project, because substitution is also one of the sub-objectives of the Critical Raw Material Act. Strategic projects, of course, will have to be flagship projects which are remarkable in terms of technology and accompanied by very strict sustainability requirements. And as soon as the project is designated a strategic project, it will benefit, among other benefits, will benefit from streamlined, predictable permitting procedures, and also the preferential access to the finance, if I can summarize it this way. Third countries, diversification of supply and also accomplishment of some of the European Union supply chain objectives also will be accomplished through the concept of strategic projects. This time, the projects will be designated not within the European Union, but in third countries. There are some additional strings attached because, of course, we typically would deal not with the European Union itself, with a relatively developed legislation in the area of sustainability and similar rules, but with the emerging or developing countries. So as you would appreciate, more strings will be attached, especially on sustainability side. But again, as soon as a project in a third country is designated a strategic project, it will benefit from improved access to the finance and also some of the de-risking mechanism for the investment. De-risking is essentially the same concept as the tax breaks and some of the other instruments which facilitate the decision making by the investor. Now, how will the project be recognized as strategic under the Critical Raw Material Act? Several criteria will be considered when going through an application. Contribution to the security of the European Union supply, so geography of the project, right, where it's coming, where the investment will be made, and where the raw materials will be either extracted or processed or recycled will be key. So will be the technical feasibility, but equally important maybe as geography will also be sustainability, something that I've already mentioned, because the CRMA, probably as a function of the legislative process where European Parliament was very active, does put a great deal of attention to the sustainability requirements, again emphasizing the need that mining boom is not accompanied by the destruction, essentially by the destruction of the planet. Criteria, some requirements are specific depending on whether the project is in the European Union or not. The investment that is being put forward benefits not only one member state, but has cross-border benefits going beyond a given country, and downstream sectors benefits are also taken into account. For third countries, however, and that's what I was mentioning as part of the sustainability discussion, geography will matter. So the concept of like-minded partners, which are probably the ones which are reliable as opposed to non-reliable. But the key issue also for the projects in third countries, which are in emerging markets, so developing countries, is that the sustainability certification scheme for that project through a third-party certification is essentially mandatory. One important addition, which was also added late in the legislative process, is on the ownership. Is that application for a strategic project, and that's for the third countries. Provide evidence on certain ownership percentage. It's 40% right now of ownership of that strategic project should be based in Europe or in the partner country. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, some of the Chinese investment, to put it blunt, or investment from non-reliable partners may be allowed, but it seems like the control over the project should stay with the European Union, the partner country, or a combination of the two. Where do you apply for a designation as a strategic project? That will be with the European Commission. It will be screening the applications in order to check where they fulfill the requirements. But also a special body, a center of expertise on raw materials will be created as soon as the regulation enters into force. That would be the European Critical Raw Material Board. It will essentially be a technical body which will deal with the application and will issue an opinion on whether the project qualifies as a strategic project or not. The CRMA provides certain deadlines, and the Commission is subject to an obligation to take a decision on whether this or another application qualifies for a designation as a strategic project. In terms of the benefits, as I already mentioned, as soon as the project qualifies as strategic, and that is relevant for the European Union, intra-European Union projects, it will qualify it from the streamlined procedures. It shouldn't come, and the CRMA is very clear, it shouldn't come, of course, and shouldn't jeopardize the quality of the screening of the application in terms of consulting the local population in terms of the environmental assessment. But still, the idea is to pool the competences within each member state, the ones which are tasked with giving a permit into one institution, and by doing so, by also training the relevant staff to facilitate and streamline the application process. And there are certain deadlines I introduced for strategic projects in processing and recycling. As soon as all the documentation is in, the length of permit process shouldn't exceed 1 year, while similar projects in the extraction sectors, the process should not exceed 2 years for them. In terms of improved access to finance, something I started my presentation today from, you won't see actual, unlike under IRA, unlike under neighboring related legislation in the United States, you will not see under CRMA right now anything specific in terms of the financial instruments which will be implemented with any level of a detail. The idea, however, is to employ both public and private financing, and essentially using the Critical Raw Material Board in interaction with the Commission and interacting with the public financial institution of the European Union, is to have a process where a designated project as a strategic project will get a financing that it needs to take off. That applies both to the intra-European Union projects as well as the strategic projects under the third countries, with in addition that for third country strategic projects, the funds under the Global Gateway Strategy will be used. And as many of you know, Global Gateway Strategy is Europe's response to the China's Belt and Road initiative. It's essentially a fund with 300 billion euro in it. And the idea is to use part of that money as one of the financing vehicles for the strategic projects. The CRMA will also relax or aims at relaxing the stated rules, which would allow clearance by the European Union of instruments like tax breaks at the national level. There is also a possible intent expressed in the CRMA to create a dedicated raw material fund at the European Union level, and also use the export credit facilities to advance projects, especially as far as the investment into third countries is concerned. A coordination of access to finance with private stakeholders is also one of the tools that the CRMA puts forward. There will be a subgroup created at the level of the European CRM board, which would coordinate and issue recommendation, of course, to the public institutions, but taking into account the possible commitment from the private sources on how to invest into the strategic projects in the most efficient way, taking into account all kinds of possibilities involved, including as far as the European Investment Bank is concerned, and European Bank for the Reconstruction and Development, with a European institution with a financial muscles. Two more instruments which the Critical Raw Material Act envisions. So in order to increase the demand and to provide more instrument of financing and better future in terms of financing for the strategic, not only strategic project, but overall for the strategic raw material. So the first one is strategic stocks. And here the act will proceed in 2 stages. There is a procedure envisioned that after its entry into force, an information gathering exercise will take place where the Commission will review what the member states currently have, both in terms of policies and actual strategic stocks of raw materials. And as a second step, the Critical Raw Material Board will review and will make essentially a gap assessment and see to what extent the current strategic stocks satisfy or indicate how far away they stand from what is considered to be a safe level of stocks. And depending on that, there will be recommendations issued ultimately by the European Commission to the member states that would, again, because of jurisdiction, the European Union cannot mandate on certain things. Member states cannot mandate them to buy raw materials in the strategic stocks, but there will be at least non-binding recommendations issued to member states to build up or to reshuffle their portfolio of strategic stocks in order, again, to have those stocks and to mitigate the risk of supply distortions. And another related instrument will be joint purchasing mechanism. We have it right now for the natural gas. It was recently enacted following the conflict in Ukraine and generally understood to be a success. The same instrument may be developed under the CRMA for the raw materials as well. Essentially, for those raw materials, and the list is still to be determined. There is no finite list for the joint purchasing mechanism. Because of the concentration of the supply side, there might be an economic rationale for the EU to step in and to coordinate the purchasing on behalf of the European buyers. Again, the Commission is empowered to move in this direction under the Critical Raw Material Act. One important issue on the sustainability. So putting aside the qualification on the sustainability issues as part of analysis of whether a project can be designated as strategic or not, there is one important discipline that CRMA introduces in terms of environmental footprint of the imported, of all critical raw materials. And the idea is, again, that their extraction and their supply chain overall has a lot of climate and environmental impact. And in order to incentivize the minimization of such an impact, especially for water and biodiversity, there will be an obligation, most likely as of 2026, for those companies that place raw materials concern in the European market to declare the environmental footprint of the critical raw materials that they are placing. There would be a special regulation adopted by the European Commission by the end of 2025, where it will determine which critical raw materials should be subject to such a declaration, and will also explain how you calculate the environmental footprint. There is already an annex to the Critical Raw Material Act, which has the basic meat in it about how to go about calculating the environmental footprint. But that is going to be maybe an additional sub-pillar to the whole sustainability chapter of the CRMA, an obligation similar to some other products that are already subject to extensive due diligence requirements, such as deforestation products, for example. Here, they would be going even further in many respects, is to provide an environmental footprint assessment and to disclose it so that the consumers in Europe are fully aware of the environmental footprint of respective raw materials. Two last observations on diplomacy and external relations of the Europe's raw material strategy. It is very important because, look, I mean, the objectives, and you see it, for example, on extraction, Europe has no illusions. The idea is to get to 10% of European consumption by 2030. There's not much you can mine in Europe. In the end of the day, there is recognition of that reality, even though for some of the strategic raw materials there is a disagreement. There is actually some of the experts are of opinion that you can actually extract a lot in Europe, but okay, I mean, the idea right now, the way CRMA is designed is that a lot of strategic and critical raw materials will continue being imported, and here an engagement, ideally to the same extent as China has with the third countries and with the like-minded countries, primarily is of key importance. So the Europe's raw material diplomacy has been extremely active this year. And there are various various clubs are being discussed. One of them is the Critical Raw Materials Club, which the European Commission has announced, and which will have soon its first gathering. There is a mineral security partnership. There are bilateral agreements that the Commission is signing with a quite impressive speed in order again to have a meeting of minds with the resource-rich countries and to facilitate cooperation and future investments. And finally, and very importantly as well, for ideally and hopefully convergence of the raw material policies between Europe and the United States, is the EU-US critical minerals agreement. After Japan signed the CMA, the European Union, of course, had an obvious incentive to try to accomplish the same, because right now Europe has no FTA agreement with the United States, such that is not considered an FTA partner under the IRA provisions that Megan described. The idea, however, is to negotiate such an agreement and conclude it as soon as possible, so that the critical raw materials with the European origin can be used specifically in vehicles which are eligible for the IRA credits. The negotiations are quite advanced. There was an idea to actually announce their completion at the last EU-US summit. It didn't happen. There are some sticking points left, essentially, which essentially have to do with the labor inspections that the United States insists it should have a right to conduct, similar to the inspections which are envisaged by the agreement with Mexico. And Europe is somewhat hesitant about that idea, I think, emphasizing the sufficiency and comprehensive nature of the European Union and member state legislation in that regard. But that's probably the most salient issue. The hopes of the negotiators is that CMA will actually be concluded by the end of this year, so that together with the entry into force of the CRMA, we will also have a CMA, an agreement which to a certain extent demonstrates the meeting of minds between the EU-US regulators on the issue enters into force as well. And I think in terms of conclusion on the European Union's approach, two key observations. One is we have experience with a strategic project concept in the past. So it's not something new, not something developed for CMA. We had a strategic infrastructure project, for example, under the gas infrastructure rules, and they've been quite successful in terms of diversifying the European natural gas supply, not to the 100% the way the European Union wanted, but still some very important southern corridors, for example, to supply natural gas from Azerbaijan, from some of the other locations, have been supported heavily by the framework which was created at the European level and supported by investments by the very same financial institutions that will be used to support the critical raw material act objectives. So the basis is there. There are illustrations and there is experience that these frameworks work and actually are capable of generating significant support to the projects which fit the European Union policy. So we are quite optimistic that this framework, as soon as that it's put into law, as soon as the CRMA enters into force, will create an important incentive to invest both in the mining projects in the European Union as well as in the like-minded third countries. The second observation, however, has to do with the sustainability. There are very important strings attached from the European Union to the mining project. It reflects the mindset of regulators here. So expect.
Hi, Nikolai. I had a question for you. Just clarification on one of your point about our the potential EU-US free trade agreement. When are you thinking we'll see that come to fruition more so on kind of your side, right? Because I mean, we're still kind of waiting for approvals on yours. I mean, it's still in the approval process, correct?
I mean, it's a function of negotiations. So the European Commission's team has a negotiating mandate. So the key parameters of what Europe wants to achieve and what should be reflected in the CMA that has been agreed upon. The issue is really with the negotiators and the issues which are essentially left on the table. They are not of a nature that should preclude a conclusion of agreement. So there are some issues of principle, especially as far as the labor inspections are concerned. But based on what we hear from the negotiation, from the negotiators, and there was an event last week in Brussels dealing with that issues, we would expect that the agreement will be reached, at least as far as the key technical issues are concerned. Of course, there is an issue with the U.S. Congress and whether, on a practical side, whether it would take European Union where it wants to get as far as the credits are concerned under the IRA, but that would probably be that is something that the U.S. Congress will have to, or luckily for Europe, maybe not have to decide if I think the administration insists that they have enough rights to negotiate this agreement without submitting it to the Congress.
Okay, thanks. No, completely agree. Okay, well, thanks so much everyone for your time. I know that we covered a lot of information and there's a lot more that we didn't have time to cover. I know I speak for myself and Nikolai when I say we are living this all day long every day and are happy to talk to you and answer any questions you have. You can reach out to us via email or phone through the Mayor Brown website. You can find our contact information.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Megan, for leading the event today.
Yeah, no, happy to. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.